My name is Elena Vance. I'm 32 years old, chief of trauma surgery at Mercy General, and tonight I almost sent a dying man to another hospital without looking at his face. John Doe, uninsured. Stab wound, left abdomen. The administrator held out the clipboard. No insurance on this one, doctor. We can't keep him here. County hospital takes him tonight. Before I signed, I did what I always do. I checked the patient's personal effects. Standard procedure. Gloves on, evidence bag open. 2 dimes, 3 pennies, 1 quarter with a hole drilled clean through the center. I had seen that hole before. 22 years ago, my mother was sick and the men from the lending company were coming for our house. I was 9 years old. I had no one to ask except the man on Wharton Street who ran the neighborhood, the one people went to when the law wouldn't help. Everyone was afraid of him. I was too. But I was more afraid of losing my mother. I walked in soaking wet, sat across from a man with scarred hands and a green ledger, and pressed everything I had into his palm. 2 dimes, 3 pennies. He looked at the coins without a word. Then he opened the ledger, picked up his pen, and wrote my name in slow, careful block letters. Elena Reyes. Debt paid in full. He closed the ledger. Now go home, kid. He cleared the debt himself. I never knew how. I only knew that the men never came back. I went home. I became a surgeon. For 22 years, I carried that and said nothing. Tonight, that man came through my doors as a John Doe, uninsured, unidentified, no family listed. No one in that building knew his name. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. I was not sending him anywhere. I scrubbed in and took his case myself. The refrigerator had been dying for 3 years. Frank Moretti had learned to stop hearing it, the low arthritic hum that filled the kitchen from 5:30 every morning, rattling against the silence like a man trying to convince himself he was still breathing. He'd meant to replace it. He'd meant to do a lot of things. He sat at the kitchen table now, both hands flat on the scarred wood surface, as if steadying himself against something that hadn't moved yet. The table had been his mother's. She'd brought it over from a row house on Passyunk Avenue when Frank was 9 years old, and the surface bore the evidence of every meal, every argument, every winter she'd ever hosted in this house, knife cuts and coffee rings and one long, brown burn mark from a pan. She'd forgotten on a July afternoon in 1971. Frank had never refinished it. It seemed dishonest somehow to sand away what had actually happened. The letter sat in the center of the table. He hadn't opened a new one. He didn't need to. The language of the Medicare denial was so familiar by now that he could reconstruct it from memory after careful review of your submitted documentation. We regret to inform you the same careful, bureaucratic regret that cost absolutely nothing to produce and everything to receive. This copy had arrived 3 days ago. He'd read it twice, set it down, and hadn't touched it since, though he found his eyes returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. The morning light came in gray through the window over the sink. October in South Philadelphia had a particular quality of light, not the soft amber of September or the hard white of November, but something in between, a light that seemed genuinely unsure of its intentions. It fell across the kitchen linoleum, across the edge of the table, across Frank Moretti's hands. As he finally reached for the weekly pill organizer he kept beside the salt shaker, he opened the Sunday compartment first. 3 pills out of 7. He set them on the table one by one, touching each lightly with his index finger before sliding them to the side. Then Monday. Then Tuesday. He got through Wednesday before he hit the first empty slot, the metoprolol, the beta blocker his cardiologist had adjusted upward after the stress test in August. The compartment was not empty because he'd forgotten to refill it. It was empty because the refill cost $240, and his account at Jefferson Federal, as of yesterday morning, held $112. He sat with that for a moment. His hands were trembling again, the fine, shallow tremor that had started 6 months ago, and that the cardiologist had attributed, with careful vagueness, to cardiovascular stress. Frank knew what it actually was. It was the body's way of announcing that certain calculations had been made, certain sums were coming due, and the arithmetic was not in his favor. He closed the pill organizer and set it back beside the salt shaker with more precision than the gesture required. Outside, something moved against the gray sky. He caught it from the corner of his eye, a dark shape, smooth and deliberate, hovering above the rooftops across Wharton Street. For a half second, the old instincts fired, the ones that had kept him alive for 40 years. in a neighborhood that had tried repeatedly to prove that was unnecessary. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand, moving to the window with a quietness that his body still remembered, even when his heart no longer trusted it. The drone was matte black and the size of a large crow, and it bore no markings. He recognized, though, the angular profile of it, the aerodynamic precision, the silent rotors spoke of money. Real money, not the money of the neighborhood, which came and went with the seasons and the work stoppages and the gambling debts. This was institutional money, patient money, the kind that moved not with urgency but with calculation. It hovered above the DeLuca property on the corner for perhaps 30 seconds. Its camera, and there was a camera. He could see the lens catching the light angled downward at the roofline and the rear lot. Then it drifted southeast, slow and certain, like a man making a note. Frank watched it go. His jaw was set. There was a name printed in microscopic font along the drone's left strut, and he hadn't been able to read it from this distance, but he didn't need to. He'd heard the name 3 times in the past 2 months, in 3 different conversations with men who didn't frighten easily. Varna Fintech. Vane Fintech. Varna Fintech. He pulled on his overcoat, the gray wool one, not the good one, and went out the side door. Mrs. Gable's back door was open, which was unusual. She was 73 years old and had lived in the house beside Frank's since 1988, and she kept her back door closed and triple-latched as a matter of principle, a principle she had explained to him once, using language that suggested its origins in a very specific and unpleasant decade of her life. Frank stopped at the low chain-link fence between their properties and looked through the open door into her kitchen. She was standing at her table, and she was crying in the way that old women cry when they don't want to be seen crying, no sound. Just a steady compression of the face, the hands working fast. She had a stack of papers in front of her, and she was feeding them into the shredder she kept on the kitchen counter, the one her granddaughter had given her for Christmas 2 years ago. She fed them in 3 or 4 sheets at a time, the machine grinding steadily. "Rosemary," he said. She looked up. For just a moment, the careful compression of her expression failed, and he could see the full weight of what was on the paper she was destroying. Then she got it back. "Frank." Her voice was steady. "Cold morning. What are you shredding?" A pause. She looked down at the remaining papers in her hand, and he could see the letterhead from where he stood, the clean, modern typography, the blue and silver logo. Varna Fintech, South Philadelphia Home Equity Services. "Junk mail," she said. "You know how it piles up." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and there was something in her eyes, not quite shame, not quite fear, but a close relative of both that he recognized from many years of standing in rooms with people who were trapped. "I didn't sign anything," she said suddenly, and the words came out compressed as if she'd been holding them at pressure. "I want you to know that. Whatever they say, I didn't sign anything." He stayed at the fence for another moment. Then he said quietly, "I know that, Rosemary." And he did, and she nodded once, and he continued down the alley toward Carpenter Street. The social club had been called Moretti's once, though the sign had been repainted twice since then, and now simply read the anchor in faded red letters above the door. Frank had not owned it formally for 11 years, having transferred the deed to a cousin's LLC during a period when formal ownership had seemed inadvisable. But it was his place in the way that certain things remained a man's, regardless of paperwork, and he went there 3 mornings a week for coffee in the particular silence that a room holds when it has accumulated enough years. He was still half a block away when the neon sign over the door, the one shaped like an anchor, the one that had glowed red since 1987, flickered twice, buzzed with a sound like a trapped insect, and went out. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the dark sign for a moment. Then he went inside. The morning passed in the way that mornings pass now, coffee and newspapers and conversations with men, his age about things that no longer needed to be said carefully, which was its own kind of luxury. He was pulling on his coat to leave when his flip phone, the old Motorola he'd carried for 9 years, the one whose contact list was full of names that existed nowhere else, buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. "Payment overdue, account number 471B. Balance 14,200, automatic collection will begin in 72 hours. Vane Financial Services." He read it twice. He did not recognize the account number. He had no account with any company containing the word Vane. The amount was precise and confident in the way that false things often are. He closed the phone and put it back in his pocket. His hand found the leather pouch there, the small one, cracked and soft from years of handling, and his fingers closed around it. He could feel the 3 coins inside 2 dimes, 3 pennies. 23 cents. He'd carried it for 22 years and had never been able to say exactly why, except that some debts needed to be kept close to the body so you didn't forget what you owed. He walked out into the gray October morning. The drone was gone from the sky, but the sky still had the look of something being watched. "Something's rotting in South Philly," he said, to no one in particular. He was not a man who frightened easily, but he was a man who knew, after 68 years, the specific smell of a city turning on its own people. He pulled his coat tighter and walked home. Jefferson Federal Credit Union had been on Broad Street since 1962, and it still looked like it, the low-drop ceiling with its yellowed acoustic tiles, the carpet that had been burgundy once and was now the color of an old bruise, the teller windows with their scratched plexiglass dividers that had been installed sometime in the early 90s and never replaced. Frank had kept his accounts here for 31 years. He knew the branch manager by his first name. He knew the security guard, a retired city cop named Delgado, who worked Tuesdays and Thursdays and brought his own lunch in a blue cooler. Delgado wasn't working today. The guard at the door was young, maybe 25, with the flat, uninvested expression of a man who had been hired to occupy a uniform rather than to think. He looked at Frank without recognition and looked away again, which was fine. Frank didn't need to be recognized. He needed to see a number. He took a seat at the row of chairs beside the teller windows and waited his turn. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a frequency just below conscious awareness, but his body felt a faint pressure behind the eyes, a mild insistence that something was wrong with the air. He watched the other customers, a young woman with a stroller, a man in a DoorDash jacket counting cash, an elderly couple moving together with the slow synchronization of people who had been navigating the same spaces for decades. None of them looked at him. Everyone in this room was alone in their particular way. When the window opened, the teller was a young man Frank hadn't seen before early 20s. Dark hair, a pressed shirt that was slightly too large for him. He had the careful, downward-angled posture of someone trained to look at screens rather than faces, and he maintained it now, his eyes moving between his monitor and his keyboard, with the focused avoidance of a man who had decided, before the conversation began, how it was going to go. "Account number?" he said. Frank gave it. He had it memorized in the way he had memorized things that mattered, not written down anywhere, not stored in anything that could be taken. The teller's fingers moved. A pause. The fingers moved again. "What can I help you with today?" "I want to see my 401k balance," Frank said. "The retirement account. It's linked to the main checking." Another pause. The young man's eyes moved to the screen and stayed there. "I'm showing a balance of $412 in the linked retirement account," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone reading from a document rather than reporting information. Frank heard the number. He sat with it for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for the number to become real. "Run that again," he said. "The balance is—" "I heard the balance. Run it again." The teller ran it again. The number didn't change. Frank leaned forward slightly, both hands coming down on the marble counter. The marble was cold under his palms, cold and very smooth and completely indifferent, the way surfaces in institutions are always indifferent. "I had $47,000 in that account as of September," he said. "Where did it go?" The teller's eyes finally moved to Frank's face briefly and then back to the screen. "I'm showing a series of automated service fee withdrawals from a linked service provider, Vane Financial Services subsidiary account. The withdrawals began in," he clicked, "August 14th. I didn't authorize that. The account shows a digital authorization dated, I didn't authorize that." His voice hadn't risen, but something in it had changed, a quality that younger men in this neighborhood had once learned, through various means, to pay attention to. "I have never done business with Vane anything. I don't know what a subsidiary account is, and I don't have one. I want to speak to the branch manager." The teller's jaw moved slightly. "Mr. Hartwell is in a meeting. I'll wait." He sat back down in the row of chairs. The fluorescent lights hummed. The young woman with the stroller left. The DoorDash driver left. The elderly couple at the other window completed their transaction with the slow dignity of people who had learned patience the hard way. And they left too. And Frank sat in the humming silence and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular texture of a certain kind of anger. Not the hot, immediate anger of a younger man, but the cold, deliberate anger of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to be precise about it. He waited 22 minutes. Mr. Hartwell did not come out. A different young man eventually appeared, introduced himself as an assistant manager, and explained in careful and apologetic language that the withdrawals had been processed through a digitally authorized service agreement, and that disputing them would require a formal written complaint and a review period of 30 to 45 business days. Frank listened to all of it. Then he said, "I built this street with my blood, 31 years in this branch. And you're telling me $47,000 walked out the door, and I have to wait 45 days to find out where it went?" The assistant manager said that he understood Frank's frustration. Frank stood up. He put both hands on the counter, not aggressively, but with the weight of a man stating a physical fact. "Look at me when I'm talking about my life's work." The young man looked at him. To his credit, he held the look. "File the complaint," Frank said. "Put my name on it. And tell Mr. Hartwell I was here." He walked out into the gray October air and stood on Broad Street and breathed. The HELOC letter arrived that same afternoon. He found it in the mailbox when he got home, a crisp white envelope. The Vane FinTech logo in blue and silver on the upper left corner. The kind of envelope that had been designed to look like good news. "Congratulations, your home equity line of credit application has been approved." He read the first 3 lines standing at the mailbox and then stopped, because the application had his name on it, his address on it, his social security number on it all, the identifying information assembled with complete accuracy, and he had never submitted it. He'd owned the house outright since 2009. No mortgage, no liens, no encumbrances. He had been careful about that in the way he had been careful about certain things, understanding from long experience that a man's property was the last argument he had when all other arguments were exhausted. Someone had now filed an application against that property in his name, and someone had apparently approved it, and the approved credit line was listed as $240,000, secured against the full assessed value of the house. He set the letter on the kitchen table beside the Medicare denial and stood looking at both of them for a long time. The name came to him in pieces, assembled from the fragments he'd been collecting for weeks, the drone above the rooftops, Rosemary Gable's shredded papers, the encrypted text on his flip phone, the conversations with men who didn't frighten easily. Julian Vane. He'd heard that Vane Sr. had died 3 years ago. His predatory loan empire dismantled in a state AG investigation that had taken the better part of a decade. He'd heard that the son had taken the family money and rebuilt it into something cleaner looking and infinitely more dangerous algorithms instead of loan sharks, digital infrastructure instead of leg breakers, the same fundamental architecture of extraction wrapped in the language of innovation. He'd heard that Julian Vane was buying property. Not one house, not one block, he was buying the concept of a neighborhood, converting human beings and their decades of accumulated equity into line items in a development portfolio called South Philly Smart City. Frank understood now, with the clarity that comes when enough individual pieces finally assemble into a shape, that he was not dealing with a problem. He was dealing with a plan. And the plan had been running for some time before he'd noticed it. 22 blocks north at Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Elena Vance stood in the fluorescent corridor outside room 14 and looked at a spreadsheet on a tablet. She was 32 years old and had been chief of trauma surgery for 11 months, which was long enough to understand that the title carried obligations that hadn't been in the job description. The spreadsheet was one of them. It was titled, in the bloodless language of hospital administration, Capacity Optimization Review QR, and it contained a list of current patients flagged as high risk, low return, which meant, translated out of the administrative language into plain English, that they were elderly, uninsured or underinsured, and their continued occupancy of a bed was producing costs that could not be recovered. She was supposed to sign off on the discharge recommendations by 5 o'clock. She scrolled through the names. Most of them she recognized from rounds the faces behind the file numbers. The specific ways their bodies had failed and the specific ways their families had responded to that failure. She reached the 14th entry and stopped. Moretti Frank J., age 68, uninsured. Cardiac insufficiency, secondary complications. Flagged uninsured liability. She looked at the name for a moment. Then she looked away. At the corridor wall, at the scuffed baseboard, at nothing in particular. She had grown up in Kensington, which was not something she discussed at professional functions or mentioned in the biographical notes attached to her publications. Kensington in the early 2000s had been a neighborhood in the process of losing its argument with several forces simultaneously, and growing up, there had required a particular quality of attention. The ability to read situations quickly, to identify which adults were safe and which were not to understand that protection, when it came, rarely announced itself in advance. She remembered the name Moretti the way she remembered certain other things from that period, not with warmth. Exactly, but with the specific weight of something that had mattered when mattering was not guaranteed. She set the tablet face down on the nurse's station counter. She had patients to see. She'd think about the discharge list later. She always thought about the discharge list later, and it never got easier, and she signed it anyway, because that was the job. But she left the tablet face down, and Frank Moretti's name stayed on the list, unsigned for another day. The town hall meeting was held in a renovated warehouse on Washington Avenue that had been in a previous life a mattress distribution center. Someone had spent a great deal of money transforming it, exposed brick sandblasted clean, Edison bulbs on suspended wire grids, long communal tables of raw wood that cost more per linear foot than Frank's monthly utility bills. The signage outside read, "South Philly Forward a Community Conversation," in a font that communicated, with elegant precision, that the community being addressed was not the one that had actually lived here. Frank had heard about it from Tommy Esposito, who had heard about it from his daughter, who had seen it on an app. He'd put on his good coat, the charcoal wool, not the gray one, and walked the 6 blocks in a light rain that couldn't decide whether to commit. The room held perhaps 150 people. He recognized maybe 30 of them. The rest were younger, predominantly people who had moved into the neighborhood in the past 5 years. Drawn by the proximity to Center City and the relatively low rents that were, Frank understood now with cold clarity not going to remain relatively low for very much longer. They stood at the long tables with drinks that came in mason jars, looking at renderings projected on a screen at the far end of the room. The renderings showed South Philadelphia as it would exist in approximately 7 years, sleek residential towers with green roofs, a waterfront park where the old rail yard was, bike lanes on Passyunk, a community wellness hub where the social club currently stood. The social club was not labeled in the rendering. It had simply been omitted, the way you omit a fact that complicates a presentation. Julian Vane was standing at the front of the room when Frank came in, and Frank spent a moment looking at him before Vane noticed he was there. He was tall, taller than Frank remembered from the photographs he'd been shown, and he had the particular physical ease of a man who had never seriously expected to lose anything. He was maybe 45, dressed in the studied nonchalance of tech money, no tie, a jacket that cost $3,000 and was meant to look like it cost $400. He moved through the crowd with practiced warmth, touching arms, laughing with his head back, working the room with a fluency that would have read as genuine to anyone who hadn't spent 4 decades watching people perform versions of themselves. Frank had spent 4 decades watching people perform versions of themselves. He took a position near the back wall and waited. The presentation was thorough and well-produced. There were charts about economic development, statistics about increased tax revenue, testimonials from small business owners in similar neighborhoods that had undergone similar transformations. The word community appeared, by Frank's count, 41 times. The word displacement appeared 0 times. When Vane concluded and opened the floor for questions, the first several came from people who lived in the new apartment buildings on the east side of the neighborhood. People who asked about parking structures and dog parks and the timeline for the wellness hub. Vane answered all of them with the fluent warmth of a man answering questions he had written himself. Then Frank walked to the front. He didn't raise his hand. He simply walked forward, and the crowd parted for him in the way that crowds will sometimes part for men of a certain age and bearing, registering something in the posture and the pace that their conscious minds hadn't yet processed. He stopped about 6 feet from Julian Vane, and he looked at him, and Vane looked back, and something moved across Vane's face, a flicker, quickly controlled, of recognition. "You're taking people's homes," Frank said. No preamble, no build-up. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the actual conversation has started. Vane's expression reorganized itself into something measured and faintly sad. The expression of a man accustomed to encountering resistance that he had pre-categorized as inevitable. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've—" Frank Moretti. Wharton Street, 31 years. He let that sit. "There's a woman on my block who received a reverse mortgage application she never signed. A man 2 houses down from her got an overdraft notice on an account he never opened. My own retirement savings disappeared in 60 days through a service fee from a company I've never heard of." He paused. "You want to tell me about community investment?" Something changed in the room. Not dramatically, a slight shift in the quality of the silence. A few heads turning. Vane smiled. It was a very good smile, practiced and warm and completely empty. And Frank had seen better ones on worse men. Mr. Moretti. He said the name with a particular kind of patience. The patience of a man humoring a disturbance he'd anticipated. I appreciate your passion for this neighborhood. I really do. But the financial services concerns you're describing, those are separate regulatory matters handled by appropriate agencies. I'm talking about theft, Frank said. I'm not using a metaphor. A murmur in the crowd. Vane's smile held. You're not a king, Frank. His voice was easy, almost gentle, and he dropped the mister without hesitation, which was a specific kind of move. You're just a squatter in a city that outgrew you. The room was fully quiet now. Someone coughed. Frank felt the eyes on the back of his neck, and he knew because he'd been in rooms like this before. Rooms where the crowd was deciding who to believe, that some of those eyes were already turning away. Not in malice. Worse than malice, in the self-protective embarrassment of people who couldn't afford to be associated with the losing side. Then Vane reached into his jacket's inner pocket and produced a document. He held it up with the casual confidence of a man who had been waiting for this moment. I do need to flag something for the record, Vane said, his voice carrying the practiced regret of a man delivering necessary unpleasantness. We've had some concerns shared by several community members, I should say, about Mr. Moretti's capacity to manage his own affairs. We've initiated a legal review, and this is a preliminary power of attorney designation, pending a competency assessment. He glanced at the document with the air of someone who had merely stumbled across relevant information. I mention it only because it's publicly relevant to his ability to represent his own interests here tonight. The document had Frank's name on it. It had legal language he couldn't read from this distance. It had a signature he had never made. He looked at it. He looked at Vane. He looked back at the crowd, at the particular quality of their expressions. The discomfort, the sideways glances, the 2 or 3 neighbors he'd known for 20 years who were now studying the floor with great intensity. His hand found his cane. His grip tightened until he could feel the wood grain pressing into his palm, until the tremor in his fingers stopped against the resistance of something solid. He did not say anything more. He was not a man who argued with a room that had already decided. He understood, with the cold clarity that had kept him alive in situations more dangerous than this, that the battle happening here was not the real battle, and that the man standing across from him had chosen this location precisely because he believed it was. But as the private security 2 men in identical dark jackets moved to flank him and guide him toward the door, with the polished, apologetic efficiency of people who did this regularly, Frank's eyes moved one more time to Julian Vane. And Vane, with the unconscious arrogance of a man who believed he'd already won, was reaching back into his jacket pocket. The hardware wallet was matte black, small as a thumb drive, and it disappeared into his breast pocket with the practiced ease of a habitual gesture. But Frank had spent 40 years in rooms where information was currency, and he had learned, early and at cost, to watch hands and pockets with the same attention other men gave to faces. He filed it away. The security men walked him out into the rain. The door closed behind him. Through the glass, he could see the room settling back into the warm amber light, the crowd reforming around the long tables. Vane, resuming with a comment that produced a ripple of laughter. Frank stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the rain collecting on the shoulders of his good coat. His dignity was behind him in that room. He understood that. It had been taken cleanly and efficiently in front of witnesses, with documents, in the neighborhood he had spent his life inside, and there was no immediate way to retrieve it. He put his hand in his pocket and closed his fingers around the leather pouch. 23 cents. He walked home in the rain, and he did not hurry, because a man who had survived everything he had survived understood that urgency was a luxury you couldn't always afford, and that the most dangerous thing you could do when someone took something from you in public was let them see you run. The rain had thickened by the time he reached Kensington. He couldn't have said exactly why he'd walked there instead of home some navigational drift. The body finding its own route when the mind was occupied with other calculations. Kensington was 2 miles north and 40 years back. A neighborhood that had been struggling for as long as he could remember and was struggling still, though the specific nature of the struggle had shifted over the decades in ways that tracked the larger shifts in American life with depressing fidelity. He walked the alleys between Lehigh and Somerset, past the murals and the chain link and the row houses with their parti-colored patching. New brick beside old brick, vinyl siding over original wood, the architectural record of a place that kept repairing itself with whatever was available. The cold had come in with the dark. It was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself until it had been working on you for a while, and by the time Frank registered how thoroughly it had gotten into his joints, he had already crossed into the deeper part of the neighborhood, the part that the drone from Vane FinTech had not been hovering over, because there was nothing here yet worth calculating. He stopped at the entrance to an alley off Jasper Street to let a car pass. The three men came out of the shadow between two dumpsters. He heard them before he saw them, not much sound, just the soft compression of wet sneakers on wet pavement, close enough that his body understood the geometry before his eyes confirmed it. He turned toward the sound and the first one was already moving, and he was too old and his heart was too unreliable. And he had left his particular set of advantages behind in a different decade, and so there was only time to turn, not to stop what happened next. The first blow caught him across the shoulders and staggered him forward. The second caught him at the back of the knees and took them out. He went down against the brick wall of the alley, the rough surface, scraping his palm as he tried to catch himself, and he was on the ground before his body had finished registering that the falling had begun. They wore masks, the kind that covered the lower half of the face, purchased in any sporting goods store. They were efficient rather than frenzied, which told him something about who had sent them. Passion was a freelance quality. This precision belonged to payroll. "Hey, old man," the first one said. He was maybe 30, athletic, with the specific deliberateness of someone who had been given instructions. "Heard you had something to say tonight." Frank said nothing. He was assessing, the way the body does when options are being inventoried: weight distribution, angle of the alley, distance to the street. The math was straightforward, and it did not favor him. "Mr. Vane sends his regard," said the second one. The beating was methodical. It was not the beating of men who hated him that would have been more chaotic, more personal. This was the beating of men executing a message. And the message had a specific vocabulary: you are no longer relevant. You are no longer protected. You are no longer capable of the cost you imagine yourself to be. Every blow was a sentence in that message. Frank absorbed them against the alley wall and did not make a sound, because some kinds of dignity are entirely internal and cannot be extracted. Then the third one moved, and there was a sound, a soft, metallic click, and a different kind of cold entered the equation. The knife went in just below his left ribs. It was not deep. He understood this immediately. In the analytical way the mind processes physical information, when the body is in crisis, not deep. Angled shallow, a warning rather than a conclusion. But the cold of the steel was followed immediately by the warmth of the blood. And those two sensations together, cold then warm, told him something very clear about his current location on the spectrum of available outcomes. "Homeless thug," the first one said conversationally, as if labeling him for a file. "Used to be someone. Now you're just a pause." A gesture encompassing the alley, the rain, the dumpsters. This. They left him there. Their footsteps moved away without urgency, the way footsteps move when the men making them are confident they have made their point. Frank lay against the base of the brick wall, his back against the cold stone, one hand pressed flat against his side. The rain fell straight down in the still air of the alley, collecting in the low places. He could feel his heart beat in a way he normally couldn't, not the reliable background percussion of a functioning organ, but something more insistent, more uncertain, a rhythm with questions in it. The street light at the alley's entrance threw a long, pale oblong on the wet pavement. He watched the rain move through it. He was trying to concentrate on that, on the specific physical fact of light and water, because there were other thoughts pressing in at the edges, and he was not ready for them yet. His right hand found his jacket pocket. The leather pouch was still there. He pulled it out and held it, not opening it, just holding the familiar weight against his palm. His fingers were numb from the cold and the damp, and he could feel the shape of the coins through the leather, the slight ridge of the dimes, the smaller roundness of the pennies. 23 cents. He'd carried them for 22 years. His hand was shaking harder now. Not the fine cardiovascular tremor he'd grown accustomed to. This was something larger, some systemic response to cold and shock and blood loss that he could observe with a kind of remote clarity, the way you observe something happening to someone else. He tried to sit forward, and his side reminded him, very precisely, of its current condition. He lay back against the wall. The rain gathered in the seam between the brick and the alley floor and ran, thin and purposeful, through the grit and the pooling water. And it took the blood with it, diluted, spreading, eventually indistinguishable from the general dark water. He watched it go. 22 years of carrying this neighborhood in his chest and in his hands and in his body's accumulated record of every consequence he'd ever absorbed. And now he was absorbing one more, here at the bottom of a Kensington alley, and the rain was moving his blood into the gutter with a perfect indifference that was, he thought, its own kind of honest assessment. His fingers fumbled with the leather pouch. The coins came out 2 dimes, 3 pennies, and scattered into the thin water running across the alley floor. He watched them silver and copper catching the distant streetlight, moving a few inches, settling. Is this how it ends? The thought arrived quietly without drama, the way real thoughts do. For 23 cents? He had never been a man who asked questions he couldn't answer. He had understood for most of his life that there was a cost to everything. To protection, to loyalty, to the specific choices he had made in his 20s and 30s about what kind of man he was going to be. And he had paid that cost in various currencies over the years, and he had accepted the paying as the terms of the life he'd chosen. But this was different. This was not a cost he'd chosen. This was a debt being collected by someone who hadn't earned the right to collect it, in a currency he'd never agreed to pay. Not like this, he thought, his fingers numb in the wet, reaching toward the scattered coins. Not like a dog. He got his fingers around one of the pennies, then one of the dimes. The small, wet metal was the realest thing he had touched in hours, realer than the marble counter at the bank, realer than the documents at the town hall meeting, realer than Julian Vane's practiced smile. He closed his fist around the recovered coins and held them. From somewhere down Jasper Street, headlights swept across the alley entrance. He heard the vehicle slow, heard a door, heard voices, professional voices, with the specific cadence of people trained to encounter bad situations without being overwhelmed by them. Red and white light pulsed at the alley's entrance, washing the wet bricks intermittently with color. An ambulance. He looked at the lights. He thought about the Medicare denial on his kitchen table, about the $240 refill he couldn't afford, about the 45 business day review period for the $47,000 that had left his account without his permission. He thought about the specific cost of being brought through those hospital doors without insurance. He thought about all of that, and the thinking took about 4 seconds, and at the end of it, he was still lying in the alley, and the paramedics were still moving toward him, and his body had already made its own calculation independently of everything else. He kept his fist closed around the coins. "Sir, can you hear me, sir?" The red and white light pulsed. The rain kept falling. The blood in the gutter had traveled as far as it was going to travel. Frank Moretti closed his eyes. Friends, what a journey so far. Frank Moretti built his life on a code: protect the neighborhood. Pay what you owe. Never let anyone sink on your watch. But tonight, that code couldn't stop a knife in a Kensington alley. And now he's lying unconscious in the back of an ambulance. A fistful of 23 cents, the only thing he managed to hold on to. Julian Vane thinks he's already won. He has the documents, the drones, and the digital infrastructure to take everything Frank ever stood for. But here's what Julian doesn't know yet. 22 years ago, Frank made a different kind of investment, one that didn't go into any ledger, one that can't be deleted by an algorithm. That investment is about to walk into Mercy General in a white coat. Stay with us. The light in the memory was gold. Not the gray October light of now, but summer light. The specific light of a Philadelphia July afternoon, when the heat presses down on the row houses and turns everything amber and close. The kind of light that made even the poorest streets look briefly like they'd been painted by someone who loved them. The office had been on the second floor above the social club. Frank had kept it spare: a desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over Wharton Street, and a physical ledger, green-covered, that he'd been maintaining since 1991. The ledger was where agreements lived. Not legal agreements, he'd had lawyers for the legal things, but the other kind. The ones made between people rather than between entities. The ones that held because both parties understood that the alternative to holding them was a world nobody wanted to live in. He heard the footsteps on the stairs before the door opened. Small feet, moving fast in the way that children move when they are frightened but have committed to forward motion anyway. She was 9 years old and she was soaking wet from a summer storm that had come in off the Delaware without warning. And she was carrying something in her clenched fist with the focused intensity of a child transporting something irreplaceable. Her hair was plastered flat. Her shoes made small pools on the wooden floor. She looked at him with large, direct eyes that had already learned in 9 years not to expect too much from rooms like this. "My mom is sick," she said, "and the men said they'll take the house if we don't pay." Frank looked at her. He looked past her, through the open door at the landing. On the stairs behind her, hanging back in the shadow of the stairwell, with an expression that moved between satisfaction and calculation, was a face Frank had last seen at a courtroom in 1999. Vane Sr. The old man himself following this child up here with the patience of a man who knew the value of a prop. The girl opened her fist. 2 quarters. 3 pennies. "That's what we have. Shut, Reeves," she said. "Is it enough?" Frank looked at the coins in her small wet palm. He looked at Vane Sr. in the stairwell. He understood the math being demonstrated here, the deliberateness of it, the message. This is what your neighborhood is worth. This child, these pennies, this wet floor. He reached across the desk and took the coins from her hand. He held them for a moment, feeling their weight, feeling the specific lightness of them. Then he opened the green ledger to a new page and wrote, in his careful block letters, "Elena Reyes, debt paid in full. Collateral her future." He took one of the quarters back out of his pocket, drilled a small hole through it in the back room. He had a punch for this, had used it for years to mark things that needed marking, and put it in his pocket. The rest he put in the leather pouch. He'd been carrying it since. He'd looked up the Reyes account the following week. The loan had been structured in the way Vane Sr. structured all his loans, the terms buried in language designed to obscure them, the interest rates compounding in ways that ensured the principal could never be retired. The entire instrument. A mechanism for eventual foreclosure dressed in the language of assistance. Frank had retired the loan. He hadn't been gentle about how he'd communicated the retirement to Vane Sr., and Vane Sr. had understood the communication. And the Reyes family had kept their house. He had not seen Elena Reyes after that day. Frank came back to consciousness the way a diver comes up from depth slowly, against resistance, aware before he could see or speak that he was no longer in the alley. The ceiling above him was white and institutional. The light was fluorescent and without mercy. He could feel the pressure of an IV line in his left arm, the unfamiliar tightness of bandaging across his ribs, the remote and medicated quality of pain that has been attended to without being resolved. The social club, the floorboard under the bar. He needed someone to understand that. The green ledger was under the floorboard under the bar in the social club. He'd put it there in 2003 when certain situations had made document security important. He hadn't moved it. He hadn't needed to. The ledger contained the original documentation of the Vane family's lending practices, dates, amounts, names, the specific contractual instruments by which ordinary people had been converted into the raw material for someone else's wealth. It was evidence. It had always been evidence. He'd kept it because he'd understood, in some inarticulate way, that the Vane family's method was too efficient to be used only once. He had been right. He had simply miscalculated by a generation. His hand was closed around something. He became aware of this gradually, the fist clenched against the hospital sheet, the small, hard shapes inside it. He opened his fingers. 2 dimes. 2 pennies. 4 of the 5 coins recovered from the alley floor before he'd lost consciousness. He looked at them in his palm for a long time. The whole punched quarter was missing. He closed his hand again and held what he had and waited. The chart at the end of the bed read, John Doe, approx. 6570, stab wound L abdomen, cardiac complication during intake. Elena had seen the chart before she saw the patient. The charge nurse had flagged it as a potential transfer uninsured, no ID recovered, a complication during the ambulance ride that had required intervention and now made discharge complicated. She'd come by to review it as a formality, the way you review things you've already decided about. And she was standing in the doorway with the tablet in her hand when she saw the evidence bag on the bedside table. It was the standard clear plastic, sealed with a red strip, the kind they used for personal effects when a patient came in without family. Through the plastic, she could see a wallet, thin, brown leather, old, and a handful of coins loose in the bottom of the bag. She looked at the coins. One of them had a hole through it. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. The tablet was in her hand and her thumb was over the transfer authorization field. And she was still technically capable of completing the action she'd come here to perform. She understood all of this clearly. She set the tablet on the nurse's station counter and walked into the room. The patient was asleep or unconscious. The distinction, at this stage of sedation, was not entirely meaningful. He was a large man, or had been broad through the shoulders, Heavy-boned, the kind of physical architecture that doesn't disappear entirely even when age and illness have been working on it for a while. His hands lay at his sides on the sheet, and they were the hands of a man who had used them for things that left marks. The knuckles thickened, the skin cross-hatched with the specific scarring of decades. She picked up the evidence bag. Through the plastic, she turned the hole punch quarter to the light. The hole was not a manufacturing defect. It had been made deliberately, with a punch or a drill, and the edges were smooth with age. This had been done a long time ago, and the coin had been handled many times since. She knew the specific size and placement of that hole. She knew it the way you know the details of something that was, for a period of your life, the most important object you had ever held. She had given it to a man in an office above a bar on Wharton Street when she was 9 years old and soaking wet and more frightened than she had ever allowed herself to be frightened before or since. She had given it to him because it was everything she had, and he had taken it seriously, which was the thing she had needed more than the money. She set the evidence bag down. She looked at the man in the bed. "Cancel the transfer," she said to the nurse who had appeared in the doorway. "He stays with me." The surgery had been handled before Elena arrived. The stab wound, clean and relatively shallow, had been addressed in the ER. What remained was the cardiac complication. The stress of the trauma had triggered an arrhythmia in a heart already compromised by long-standing insufficiency and inadequate medication, and while the immediate crisis had been managed, the underlying picture required monitoring and, more pressingly, required someone with authority to override the administrative pressure toward discharge that would otherwise operate automatically on an uninsured patient. Elena overrode it. She overrode it, and then she went to her office and sat at her desk and opened the Mercy General Administrative Access Portal, which gave her, as Chief of Trauma Surgery, visibility into the hospital's financial systems that she had never previously needed to use for any purpose unrelated to budget reviews. Vane FinTech had a services contract with Mercy General. She found it in 40 minutes. It was buried in the vendor management system under the anodyne heading Digital Infrastructure Optimization Partnership, and it contained in its third appendix a list of data parameters being purchased from the hospital's patient management system. Anonymized, technically, in the way that data is technically anonymized when the anonymization is designed to be reversible. The parameters included age, insurance status, address, and a flag the system called Socioeconomic Risk Indicator, which, when she traced the algorithm that generated it, turned out to be a composite score derived from zip code, property ownership, and estimated net worth. The data was being purchased quarterly. It had been purchased for 6 quarters. She sat with that for a while. Then she cross-referenced the patient list she'd been reviewing, the high-risk, low-return discharge list, against the Vane FinTech property acquisition records she found through the city's public land registry. She was not a forensic accountant. She was a trauma surgeon who had grown up in a neighborhood where understanding systems of extraction was a survival skill, and she had maintained that skill alongside her medical ones because she had never been certain the medical ones would always be sufficient. 31 names on the discharge list. 27 addresses in the Vane FinTech acquisition target database. She closed the portal. She sat in her office in the particular silence of someone who has found the thing they were afraid they'd find. She was in the room when he came around fully, late in the afternoon. He surfaced slowly, the way the heavily medicated dew first the ceiling, then the light, then the specific quality of being indoors and horizontal and cared for, which she could see him registering with a kind of cautious confusion. His eyes found her face. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression went through several stages that she watched with the attention of someone who understood that what was being processed was not simply the fact of her presence, but the weight of 22 years of a debt he'd thought he was the only one still carrying. "The social club," he said. His voice was rough, stripped by sedation and trauma to something basic and direct. "The floorboard under the bar." She leaned forward. "There's a ledger," he said. "Green cover. Original documentation, the Vane family's lending fraud. Names, dates, instruments. All of it." A pause while he gathered the cost of speaking. "It can destroy him." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the data portal, the 31 names, the 27 addresses. She thought about the evidence bag on the bedside table, the hole punched quarter catching the light. "I know about the fraud," she said. "I found the data contract with the hospital. He's been buying patient information to identify acquisition targets." She paused. "Frank, I think your ledger and what I found together, that's a federal case. He looked at her with the clear-eyed steadiness of a man who had just heard the thing he'd been holding his breath for, without knowing he was holding it. I know who you are, we nan has heard. I've known since they brought you in. Elena Reyes. Elena Vance now, she said. I took my husband's name. A pause. He passed. 3 years ago. Frank was quiet. Then you became a surgeon. I became a surgeon. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, there was something in his face that she had not seen in the face of a man his age for a long time. Not peace, exactly, not relief exactly, but the specific expression of someone who has just understood that a calculation they made a very long time ago, in good faith and with incomplete information, has come out correctly. The ledger, he said. I'll get it tonight, she said. The social club was locked, but it had been locked in the same way for 11 years the deadbolt original to the building. The spare key kept in the hollow of the third concrete step below the side entrance, a hiding place Frank had established in 1994 and never changed because the best security, in his considered experience, was the security that looked like nothing. Elena found the key on her second attempt, crouching on the wet steps in the midnight quiet of Wharton Street with her coat pulled close. Inside, the club was exactly what 20 years of institutional memory smelled like: old wood. Cigarette smoke so thoroughly absorbed it had become structural, the ghost of 1,000 breakfasts. She used the flashlight on her phone rather than the overhead lights, moving through the dark room with the narrow beam sweeping low. The bar was a long L-shaped construction of mahogany that had come out of a hotel demolition in the 80s, and Frank had told her the floorboard under the bar, third section from the end. She counted from the end. The third section of flooring, behind the bar's kick rail, had a seam that didn't quite match the surrounding boards. Tighter, newer, the wood a slightly different finish. She crouched and pressed. The board moved. The ledger was wrapped in oilcloth inside a metal box that had kept it dry through 3 decades and 2 roof leaks. She sat on the floor behind the bar and opened it on her knees and read the first page with her phone's flashlight. It was exactly what Frank had described, and it was more. The Vane family lending operation had been documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood. That paper was the only weapon that outlasted the man holding it. Names, dates, loan amounts, interest structures, the specific language used in the contracts, the specific mechanisms by which properties were transferred when borrowers defaulted. 27 names, 27 addresses, and beside each address, in Frank's careful block letters, a notation paid. Clear. 1998, 2001, 2003. The dates he'd settled the debts himself, removed the instruments, returned the deeds. The Vane family had run this machine for 20 years with Frank Moretti as the only reason it hadn't consumed the entire neighborhood. Now Julian Vane had rebuilt the machine, and Frank was 68 years old and in a hospital bed, and the machine had been running for 6 quarters unchecked. She rewrapped the ledger, put it in her bag, and walked out into the night. The federal prosecutor's name was Marcus Webb, and Elena had never met him. But she knew his name from the legal aid network she'd been supporting financially since her residency, a network that operated in exactly the neighborhoods that Vane FinTech had been targeting, and that had, over the past 8 months, been accumulating a file on Vane's acquisition practices that was substantial but not yet sufficient. She reached him through the network's senior attorney at 7 in the morning, after 4 hours of sleep, with the ledger on the table in front of her and the printed documentation of the hospital data contract beside it. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. Webb was a careful man. He had the measured, deliberate energy of someone who had learned, through experience, the cost of moving before a case was fully built. He went through the ledger page by page. He went through the data contract line by line. He asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, and Elena answered all of them. And Frank reached by phone from his hospital bed. His voice rough, but his thinking clear, answered the rest. The hardware wallet, Frank said through the phone speaker. He had it at the town hall meeting. Slipped it into his breast pocket after he showed the POA document. Matte black, small. That's where the digital ledger is the record of the acquired properties, the algorithm, the fee structures. If you can connect the data contract to the acquisition algorithm, you have the full mechanism. Webb was quiet for a moment, writing. The POA document, he said. The forged one. I never signed it. I never underwent a competency assessment. I don't know who the notary is, but the notarization is fraudulent. That gives us wire fraud, elder financial abuse, document fraud. And if the data contract constitutes a HIPAA violation, which I believe it does. We have federal jurisdiction. Webb set down his pen. He looked at the ledger one more time. I've been building a case on Vein FinTech for 18 months. The acquisition pattern was clear enough, but the mechanism was buried. He touched the edge of the ledger carefully, the way you touch something old and important. This is the mechanism. How long? Elena asked. 48 hours. Maybe less. I want to move before he moves the hardware wallet. The groundbreaking ceremony for South Philly Smart City had been planned for months, and Julian Vane had not canceled it. Elena understood this, watching the coverage on her office computer the following morning. He hadn't canceled it because cancellation would have been an acknowledgement that something was wrong. And Julian Vane, she had come to understand, was a man constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that anything was wrong. He had built an entire operating philosophy around the proposition that he was always already ahead of any opposition, that the architecture of his methods was too sophisticated to be threatened by anyone who still thought in the old categories. He was standing at a podium on the corner of Washington and Fifth in front of a crowd of investors and city officials and cameras when the federal vehicles arrived. 3 of them, no lights, no siren, which was its own kind of statement. Webb's people moved with the measured efficiency of a well-planned operation, which this was, and the crowd's reaction moved in the exact sequence Elena would have predicted: confusion, then recognition, then the specific silence of a large group of people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what was happening. Julian Vane, she heard through the live feed on her computer. Federal warrant. She turned the screen off. She was in Frank's room when the news broke on the television, mounted in the corner of the ward. The footage showed the arrest vein between 2 agents, his expression for the first time in the coverage she'd seen of him carrying something genuine. Not the calculated warmth of the town hall, not the practiced confidence of the investor presentations, but the specific look of a man for whom the future has just contracted dramatically. Frank watched the screen. His hands were on the sheet, still. The hole punch quarter was on the bedside table now, retrieved from the evidence bag she had asked the nurse, and the nurse had accommodated her. And it sat there in the afternoon light, small and old and more solid than the circumstances had any right to require it to be. The court injunction came through 3 hours later. Webb's office texted her, immediate freeze on all Vein FinTech accounts. Deed transfer injunctions filed. Property reversions proceeding. She looked up from her phone. Frank was looking at the ceiling. Rosemary Gable, he said. On my block. She was shredding papers she never signed. I know. She's on the list. Her deed comes back. He nodded. A long pause. The whole block? The whole block. She paused. Frank, all 27 addresses from your ledger. The court wrote it in ink. He was quiet for a while after that, and she let him be quiet because some things need to be absorbed without assistance. And she had learned in 11 months as a chief of trauma surgery and 32 years as a person who had survived Kensington, that the most important thing you could do for someone processing the arrival of justice was to not fill the silence with anything less than justice was worth. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at the quarter on the table. The anchor still holds, he said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a man confirming a fact he'd been uncertain of, finding it true and filing it away. Elena looked at the quarter too. Then she looked at Frank Moretti, 68 years old, in a hospital bed that should by rights have been someone else's bed in a facility 40 miles away. And she thought about 9 years old and 2 quarters, and 3 pennies in a green ledger, and the specific generosity of someone who had taken seriously a debt that everyone else would have dismissed. Today, she said quietly, the court wrote in ink what your heart had been shouting in silence. He closed his eyes. The afternoon light came through the window in the particular way of late October light in Philadelphia slant. Golden, already going. Spring came to South Philadelphia with its usual modesty, not a declaration, but an accumulation. A gradual lightening of the sky and the air, the appearance of green in the strip gardens between the row houses, the sound of children returning to the sidewalks with the confidence of people reclaiming territory that winter had only temporarily occupied. 6 months had passed since the arrest. The Vein FinTech case had moved through the federal system with a speed that Webb attributed to the quality of the evidence, and that Elena attributed to the quality of Webb. And the result was a settlement and a guilty plea that had been announced on a Tuesday in February to moderate coverage in the local papers and significant coverage in the trade publications that tracked financial crime against elderly Americans. which was apparently a beat that existed and had readers, which Frank had found quietly satisfying. The social club had been reopened as a legal and medical clinic. It had taken 3 months to get the permits and the equipment and the staff in place, and it had taken the better part of Frank's recovered savings restored by court order, the $47,000 returned with interest plus a matching grant from the Legal Aid Network and a contribution from Mercy General, that Elena had negotiated with the hospital administration in a meeting she described to Frank afterward as productive, once I explained the alternative. The clinic occupied the full ground floor. The bar was still there, they'd voted to keep it, which Frank had appreciated, but it was now a reception desk. The mahogany surface polished to a warmth it had probably last had sometime in the 90s. The pool tables were gone. In their place were 2 examination rooms, a legal consultation office, and a room that the staff had taken to calling the common room, which held a coffee maker, a long table, and a revolving set of neighbors who came by for reasons that were sometimes medical and sometimes legal, and sometimes simply the reason that human beings have always gathered in particular rooms because the room held something they needed, which was other people who understood the specific weight of the life they were living. Frank sat on the front porch of the clinic in the late afternoon, in the wooden chair someone had placed there. Not him, he didn't remember asking for it, but it fit the porch perfectly, and he had stopped questioning the small, unrequested kindnesses that seemed to have followed him since February. His coat was the gray one. The good coat was inside on its hook for the days that required it. The park was across the street. This was perhaps the thing he was least accustomed to, not the clinic, not the restored deed to his house, not even the relative steadiness of his heart under the medication he could now afford, but the park. The lot where the city had planned, under the Smart City proposal, to build the first phase of luxury residential towers, had been purchased by the Community Land Trust that the Legal Aid Network had helped incorporate, and the city, in a burst of accountability that Frank recognized as the kind of thing that happened when federal prosecutors and local press were paying attention simultaneously, had approved the park proposal and funded the first phase of its construction. It was not a grand park. It had a basketball court with new nets, a small playground, a few benches, a strip of actual grass that was currently occupied by 3 dogs and their owners, and a group of children playing a game whose rules were clearly improvised and hotly contested. The trees were young, planted 8 weeks ago, still staked, their trunks thin enough to circle with one hand, and they would take years to provide the shade that the neighborhood would eventually require. But they were there, and they were growing, and on an afternoon in late April with the light coming in at its golden angle, they looked exactly like what they were a beginning. He watched a boy of about 10 navigate a dispute over the rules of whatever game was being played with the focused intensity of someone for whom justice, in its most immediate form, was a matter of genuine urgency. The boy argued his case with his whole body, arms wide, expression indignant, and the group listened and debated and eventually reached a consensus that the boy accepted with the dignified satisfaction of someone who has been taken seriously. Frank watched the whole proceeding and felt something move in his chest that was not the arrhythmia. He heard her on the steps before the screen door opened. Elena sat in the chair she'd moved to the porch 3 weeks ago, the one that matched his without being identical. She was wearing her clinic director's badge clipped to the collar of her jacket, which she wore the way she wore everything without self-consciousness, because the work was the work and the title was only relevant insofar as it let her do more of it. She'd left Mercy General in March. The resignation had been, by her account, straightforward. She'd explained to the hospital administration that she intended to operate a community clinic, and that she would prefer to do so with their blessing, and that she had prepared a detailed account of the data contract irregularities for the state medical board in case the conversation went differently. The conversation had not gone differently. She handed him an envelope without preamble. He opened it. Inside was a crisp $100 bill. He looked at it. He looked at her. "For the interest," he said, straight-faced. "That's my line," she said. "I was going to give that to you." "Then why did you put it in an envelope and give it to me?" "Because I thought it was symbolic." "It is symbolic." He held it out to her. "So is this." She took the 100 back and reached into her jacket pocket and put something in his hand, the same familiar weight. He opened his palm. 4 coins, 2 dimes, 2 pennies. His. "You still had it," he said. "I kept it with the evidence bag for 6 months. Figured it would come back to you eventually." He closed his fingers around the coins. 20 cents now, not 23. The whole punch quarter was on his bedside table at home, and he intended to keep it there because it seemed right to have the two pieces of the same gesture in different places, the way certain things distribute themselves across time without losing their original meaning. He put the coins in his shirt pocket over his heart where he could feel them. Across the street, the boy with the animated interpretation of game rules had apparently won his argument definitively because the group had resumed playing with a new energy. The dispute resolved and the game better for having been argued. The young trees moved slightly in the late afternoon when someone inside the clinic was laughing. He could hear it through the screen door. A genuine laugh, the kind you can't manufacture. He thought about 40 years. He thought about the specific weight of a neighborhood, which was not the weight of bricks or asphalt, but of the accumulated presence of people living alongside each other in the ordinary difficulty of their lives. The small negotiations and the large ones, the debts paid and the ones that couldn't be paid, and the ones that got paid in currencies that weren't money. He thought about what it meant to have held a line for a long time without knowing whether the line was holding anything. Elena said nothing for a while. She was watching the park too, or she was watching nothing in particular, which in his experience was sometimes the same thing. Frank looked at his hand steady now, or nearly so. The tremor reduced to something subclinical, his cardiologist's word, meaning it existed but was no longer announcing itself. He looked at his name on the clinic deed, which he could see through the front window framed on the wall above where the bar register used to be. Frank J. Moretti, founder. He had signed it on a Tuesday morning in January at the same table, with Elena across from him and the legal aid attorney and Tommy Esposito and Rosemary Gable as witnesses. And his hand had been steady for the signing in a way it hadn't been for anything in 3 years. He breathed in the April airgrass and exhaust and the particular mineral smell of city pavement after rain, and he let it out slowly. Starting over isn't failure, Elena said beside him quietly. It's freedom. He thought about that. He thought about 68 years of a certain understanding of strength, the kind that expressed itself through protection and intervention and the maintenance of a particular order. He thought about a Kensington alley and a hospital bed and a federal courtroom in this porch, in this light with these coins over his heart. At 68, he said, I finally learned that the strongest anchor isn't power. He looked at the kids in the park, the thin young trees, the street where he had lived his entire life. It's the people you refuse to let sink. The screen door opened and closed somewhere inside a patient arriving or leaving, or the coffee maker, finishing its cycle, and the clinic continued its work in the ordinary, unheroic way that genuine work continues one person at a time, one afternoon at a time, with no guarantee of anything except the effort itself. Frank sat in his chair and watched the park. The light came in gold and even. He was home. Friends, how did you find today's story? Frank Moretti came into this story with a failing heart, an empty pill organizer, and 23 cents in a leather pouch he'd been carrying for 22 years. He didn't come into it with resources. He didn't come into it with youth or health or the kind of protection he'd once been able to provide himself. He came into it with something harder to quantify, a debt he'd taken seriously when no one would have blamed him for ignoring it, and a code he'd maintained long after the world that formed it had moved on. That code almost got him killed, and it also saved him, because the debt he'd honored in a summer office in 2004 walked into Mercy General 22 years later in a white coat and recognized a coin and said, he stays with me. Here is what I keep thinking about after Frank's story. We live in an age of systems, algorithms, automated fees, data contracts, digital instruments designed by very intelligent people to move wealth upward in ways that are difficult to trace and easy to dismiss as the neutral operation of technology. These systems do not target people at random. They target people who have spent their lives building something real, a house, a retirement account, a neighborhood, and they move against those people with precision and patience and the institutional confidence of entities that expect not to be resisted. Frank Moretti resisted, not because he was exceptional, because he had, over the course of a long and complicated life, understood something essential, that the things worth protecting are always the same things. The woman in the house next door, the man who built something with his hands and can't afford the medication to keep his heart going, the child who walks into a room with everything she has in her palm and asks if it's enough. It is always enough. That is what Frank's ledger said, written in careful block letters in 1991 and every year after debt paid in full. That is the lesson I am taking from South Philadelphia today. Not that the good always win, they don't, and Frank would be the first to tell you that, but that the anchor holds when it's made of the right material, and the right material has never been power. It's always been the people you refuse to let sink. I hope this story brought you something to carry with you today, something worth keeping, like 23 cents in a leather pouch. If it did, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means everything to this channel, and it helps us bring you more stories like Frank's. We'll see you next time, friends. Take care of each other.